When Uber first launched, there was a brilliant designer somewhere who said, what we should do is put these little taxis driving around on the loading screen so that when somebody who's hesitant, that never has done these things, they get a couple different signals from that. One, everybody's doing it because there's all these taxis around me, so I'm not the only one that thinks it's crazy to get into a car with a stranger. And two, there's availability that I don't have to wait here forever because I can see that there's a little icon.
Visualizing taxis solved a real problem. That's exactly the kind of psychological insight that turns a decent product into a category winner. And that's the kind of insight that marketers need to understand, but often leave to the UX team.
Instagram. When you would first upload a photo on Instagram, what it wouldn't do is sit there and make you wait for an upload to 3G network. It would do it in the background and you'd go on to another step. But the perception was speed, was that this was a very fast application. And somebody designing experience knew that the crappy part about it was when you take a picture and try to share it with your friends, you'd sit there and wait for 30 seconds.
Perception beats reality every time. Coming up, Nick breaks down what he learned from 44 million Airbnb reviews, why going to conferences is better user research than focus groups, and how to ensure your research drives action instead of sitting on a shelf. Real quick, if you're not subscribed, fix that now. Every week, we bring you the people who actually build the products that you use every day, and they're sharing the psychology and strategy behind what worked.
Welcome back to Horizons Podcast, where I sit down with marketing leaders to get them to spill their secrets for the rest of us. I'm your host, Nate Desmond, and today I'm excited to be sitting down with not a marketing leader, but a UX leader. Nick Cawthon, welcome to the show.
Nate, how are you? I'm excited to spill some secrets as well.
I'm looking forward. And Nick is a very interesting UX person. He has a background that goes back to the beginning of the internet, practically. He's a veteran of the UX industry since before it was called UX. And I actually would love to start there in our first question. You worked at Alta Vista in the early 2000s. I believe you worked on the first ever image search engine on the internet. What have we lost today that we got right back in those early days of the internet?
Yeah, I prefer the positive space, not the negative space. We've lost a bunch, but what have we grown back in its place? It feels like those early days are here again. With the sort of explosion of technology that we've seen in the last 6 to 12 months, the attention that has now come to what are we going to do with this? And we're seeing some sort of misfires. We're seeing a lot of products that don't really have substance or traction. And that felt a lot like those early days. We're seeing a lot of hype. If you remember, there was these companies that would rise and fall in valuation of X or minus 10X in the span of weeks and months. Was traveling with a friend over the weekend who was talking about e-opinions and how they fielded an offer of $1 billion for this company that really concentrated on user reviews, which was a unique proposition at the time. And they received an offer from CBS for $1 billion. And within like 6 weeks, they were valued at 10 million. And he couldn't fathom, especially as an employee who had a financial stake in the executives approving this offer, how you could change perspective so quickly from this is the most valuable thing in the world to this is absolutely nothing. And that was the rise and fall of the stock market and the top .com bust. But the testament was that interesting times, and you were seeing perspectives change on a basis that was drastically shifting. And I think that's where as we're seeing valuations of a company like OpenAI or Anthropic or Figma over the last couple of weeks, these markers or perspectives of where things are going, for better or for worse, and those three mentions are just as interesting. So calling back to those Alta Vista days, it's been a while since we've felt that kind of upheaval.
That's exciting. That's very, very exciting. Do you think that helps to grow the field of UX and the almost evolution of how humans interact with computers more quickly?
Yeah. Yes, quickly. Growth it is, again, it's kind of positive, negative space. You're leaving things behind and you're gaining new things. And back 20 years ago, we had people coming in from disciplines like journalism and painting and visual design, and it was all about how do we translate the things that we used to do into the things that we're doing now. And I think that's the case with UX is like, well, we're bringing in these things that we used to do: qualitative research, service design, content hierarchy, go-to-market strategy, these things that brand extensions that were secondary or ancillary disciplines to design and experience. and now having to rethink what's my role in all of this? Where am I going to fit in? Again, when the landscape shifts and change and the tools become a lot murkier with their distinctions between who's doing what, that kind of reimagining what your core competencies are is something that is happening at a faster speed.
And fundamentally, for myself, I work in marketing. A lot of the listeners are also marketers. For those of us who may not be in UX ourselves, would you say UX is more about discovering how humans want to interact with machines, or is it more about evolving trends in how cultures interact or today's humans interact versus humans 20 years ago?
Yeah. That's a good question. There's an off-cited example, but I will cite it yet again. Back when the peer economy was being introduced, this concept of a stranger's home or a stranger's car, and that we could trust one another to be able to perform services and sort of eschew the large hotels or cab companies and be able to, based upon trust and reputation, be able to do things like ride sharing. And the model of taxi cabs was pretty flawed, where you would pick up a phone, you would call a dispatcher. The English wasn't always great, the connection wasn't always great, and the signals were always so staticky. And I don't mean that from the audio quality. It was just a guess of when a taxi would be somewhere by you and how many minutes and what their name was or the license plate. And that was all just interpretive. But, when Uber first launched, there was a brilliant designer somewhere, a UX designer, who said, what we should do is put these little taxis driving around on the loading screen so that when somebody who's hesitant, that doesn't want to do these things or never has done these things, they get a couple different signals from that. One, everybody's doing it because there's all these taxis around me. So I'm not the only one that thinks it's crazy to get into a car with a stranger. And two, that there's availability, that I don't have to wait here forever because I can see that there's a little icon. It was a great approach to an experience that addressed emotional needs. The advent of Uber meant that you didn't have to stand there waving your arm on the curb, which was a very embarrassing experience for humans to shout and wave, hey, I need a ride somewhere. And so it really alleviated that kind of exposure to humans. A little side story. I was not too far from here at a co-working space, a different co-working space, and the manager there, found out I was a designer, and she said, there's this company called Air Bed and Breakfast, and they're looking for a designer, and what they do is that you can use them to stay on other people's couches. And I thought that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. You can use a website and find places to stay on like no, no. And then 15 years later, I went to consult with them on a different project, analyzing 40 million reviews. So I think that their traction was there. So going back, those kinds of human experiences are things that we should bring to the table of UX. And for marketers, it's like knowing those pain points and translating them into good copy and good strategy, as well as good interfaces.
And that's fascinating to see how, like taking that Uber example of the cars, you're really showing something rather than telling it. You can say in text, hey, we have cars available, there are 12 cars on the road near you, or whatever the case may be. But showing that visually makes such a bigger impact than just telling someone what the case may be. How do you think about the element of truth and honesty? And you're communicating something that is true, that there are cars on the road, but you're doing it in a way that is kind of actually not true, that this specific car is out on the road right here.
Yeah. Another one happened down the street at the Moscone Convention Center. I think it's 2008, Macworld, where Steve Jobs held out this iPhone thing and went like this and went in all these contexts. And the joke with whenever you see an iPhone presentation, the contacts all have like 5-letter first names and 5-letter last names. And they're perfectly like, it's very waspy. The context are displayed because it's so visually perfect. And that animation was fake of him scrolling up and showing the processing power of that iPhone, which was still several months away from being launched. I think it didn't come out until the holiday season. And, that wasn't true, but it made for good theater. Instagram as well. When you would first upload a photo on Instagram, what it wouldn't do is sit there and make you wait for an upload of a photo to, I guess at the time, a 3G network. It would do it in the background and you'd go on to another step. But the perception was speed, was that this was a very fast application. And somebody designing experience knew that the crappy part about it was when you take a picture and try to share it with your friends, you'd sit there and wait for 30 seconds and you'd miss out on the excitement that was happening around you. And so their improvement of background processes and intuitive sort of user user interfaces really made it a lot easier. Yes, they're true, but sometimes you gotta fake it to make it.
How do you think about the merging of the disciplines? Because Instagram's a really fun example, actually, where you're right, they simplified the upload process, and that's huge and crucial at the time because it took a long time to upload images. And that was a merge of both the front end UX and also the back end engineering to make it actually upload in the back end. How often are UX wins purely about UX? And how often are they about you also need to do this engineering, or you also need to do this product, or you also need to do this other element?
I think they're always about the latter of the two. They're always about how are we going to get this done. One of the things that's so thrilling with these generative tools is there's always existed a gap between design and vision and implementation and development. And that designers were pushing and pushing and pushing and wanting and wanting and wanting. And when the rubber met the road, compromises had to be made. Well, now designers can work in a development space. Now designers have the same access to the same code base of which trains the model for which the designer says, I want this component to do this thing and I want this to do that thing, and can use the components that are already made in order to reduce the gap that the developer has to do interpreting what can often be an abstraction of a design. So I think it's extremely important. And what distinguishes designers is that they can be attuned to the environment for which they're designing in. If you were to ask an architect to design your house who has lived in a desert and you live in the jungle, I think that architect would have a hard time of understanding some of the constraints to homes in the jungle. A lot of bugs fly in, a lot of rain, it's hot, then it's cold. And then, so how am I going to design the doors and the windows and the insulation, HVAC, and all of the things that come into play with the context of which you live in? The same thing's true with designers that don't understand. Here are the constraints with the front end code base with a package.json file and libraries and dependencies and new components, different responsivity states, and the things that front end developers eat and breathe all day. And so those are some distinguishing, and they're going to get even more important going forward because I think you're going to see design and development start to consolidate with one another because we're going to be using the same tools rather than the drawing that we've traditionally done in the last 20 years.
And I'm very curious to go deeper into that. If you go back over the last 5 to 10 years, anything that you're doing in UX, you're generally drawing these components and then you're handing it to an engineer and asking them to help implement it. You've done some stuff where you're actually implementing. How do you do that in a way that the engineering team isn't saying, oh, this is creating bugs or problems in our code base? How do you do that in a way that they're trusting you to also be an editor there?
Yeah. You ask and beg for forgiveness. I am the worst version control. I am the worst code committer on the planet. The number of rebases I've had to make because my practice of a clean code base is so rudimentary. And so I think it's important early on to be transparent about what you're trying to do and why you think it might save time at the end. Because I don't think a developer wants to take design comps and reinterpret them. I think they would much rather work with a designer side by side and see that this is the conditions and the logic and the variables that the designer is introducing, because there are no design and prototyping tools that can mimic the experience of the web. It hasn't been close, and it also hasn't been a focus. There used to be a prototyping tool called Xure, not the Microsoft product, but AXURE, that used the jQuery library to mimic what it felt like to hit an error state or tabs or variables. And that fell by the wayside with the advent of Figma 10 or so years ago. But even Figma, its prototyping abilities were really poor and are so today. And it's not a good assimilation of what the web should be. It's beautiful the way that it handles design components and variables, and that atomic design system is fantastic, but it's still a design tool. And prototyping and trying to get the prototypes as close to the code base as possible with the assistance of a front end engineer, I think is a much faster rate of speed because you can put these prototypes in front of people and see how it performs and do qualitative research and understand where that product market fit might or might not be.
I'd love to get super tactical because I think for a lot of people, probably including myself, this feels like, okay, I get this in theory, but actually using something like Cursor that you've mentioned or writing code, even with AI, sounds very scary. How do you do this in practice? So let's say you're working at Uber and you want to test two new interfaces for the car waiting interface. How do you actually put that in code, get the two different versions, put it in front of people for user testing?
Yeah, the misnomer is I can put it in Replit or Lovable, and I can create interfaces, and then I can put it in front of people. That's 0 to 1. When we work at Uber, we're already at 100. We can't go from 0 to 1. And so in the past, what I've done is I've, with again, an employee badge and email address, had access to the front end code base, cloned it down, understood the structure and the hierarchy of the React application of which the front end engineers built, including all of the components that have already been built, the CSS files and that kind of structure. And then you tell your, whether it be Cursor or Claude Code or whatever coding tool you might use, don't touch the package.json file. If we're using a specific version of React or a specific framework for JavaScript or a specific dependency, like if you start bringing in other things than what the engineers have already approved, then it's going to be more trouble than it's worth trying to unwrite and untangle that. So you really have to set on guardrails of what the extensions of the brand are going to be, as well as what kind of dependencies and libraries are going to be used. But once those are in place, then it can start to move. You understand that these are the different pages and components that are going within each page from a design standpoint, prototyping standpoint. At some point, you pull it away from the database, Postgres or SQL or whatever it might be. What I've done is I've replaced that with Google Sheets. And each tab in Google Sheets is a assimilation of a table, and it keeps me responsible about the movement of data from one state to the next. And I know it's not robust. You're doing this as a sort of very low level prototype of hundreds or thousands of rows, not millions, but it gets the job done. You understand loading states and error states and all the conditions that come with the movement of information through the browser, which is the whole premise of the web to begin with, is to try to make that seem smooth and flow.
And then how would you get that in front of people? Do you load it onto something like you mentioned, Replit, or how do you actually get a prototype in front of humans?
Yeah. I first build it locally and then I deploy it out to a hosted environment that has an authentication so it doesn't leak out onto the world. I showcase any new components that we might have built as an assembly of existing parts. I tag them with this is a new code component. We'll also link to the database tables, the quote database tables, um, and and then put that in front for testing. And that is where the fun begins. Is they can really start to see how people are tabbing and typing, and hopefully not mouse movement and clicking, but really trying to move efficiently through the experience. A lot of what I do is either B2B or internal tools where it's not so much about the brand extension, it's about how do you move the user through this experience very quickly because they have to do it 10 times a day. And the more efficiently that they can do it, the faster they can get their job done. And so my attention is very much on the objective and not so much on the subjective.
That's interesting. Well, I would love to get you to work on the expense report company we use. But setting that aside, you sound like an engineer when you're saying this. Does someone need to be an engineer to be able to do this? Or is it actually possible to do this as a UX person, a marketing person, someone who doesn't know what a .json file even is?
No, I mean, it's does the architect need to live in the jungle to design a house for the jungle? No, but they should visit and they should talk to people who also live in jungles and understand what they go through in their life. So if you're a designer and you're not an engineer, you should at least sort of sit side by side with one as they receive design components and have to translate that into whatever library they're working on, or they have to install other dependencies and make sure that there's no conflicts or security issues, and go through all the lamentations that they might have, and being downstream from guys like us, and people like us would be the more inclusive term. And I think that to be contextual towards the experience that you're delivering is going to improve wherever you are. If you're a print designer, you'll understand what it means to leaf through a magazine or to look at a poster from afar. You'll have a good sense of how your work is being presented. A gallery, I once bought a photograph from a guy in Santa Fe, who, when he delivered his print, he said, "This is how you should frame it, and this is how you should light it, because this is how this photographer wanted his work to be displayed." And it was fine, but not everybody has the same gallery and lighting that he wanted it. And so as we look at that gap between design and development, the more that you understand its context of implementation, I think the better designer you will be.
That's actually a really fascinating concept, because you think about vertical integration in a business, like, oh, you are a manufacturer of clothes and now you're also selling clothes to the end user rather than wholesale. But that also applies to our careers. If you are a visual designer or if you're a marketer, how can you get into these other areas to understand how to interact with them better? Do you think for this one specifically, when it comes to coding, if someone's listening is like, wow, I'm inspired to try some of this and dip my toe in? I've seen cases where people have tried or where I've tried and it's overwhelming and you sort of give up. Where's a good place to get started and actually have some initial success that's encouraging and shows you can keep going and learning a little bit of how the engineering side works?
Yeah, I mean, these getting started is that 0 to 1 moment, is that wow moment of I'm typing something in and magic came out the other end. The purple sparkles that every brand that uses AI likes to. I'm looking around the screen at Riverside and see if there's any purple sparkle
It's
icons.
probably here somewhere, right?
Yeah, there'll be one. And so, I think those are really magical moments. It's, something I like to say on podcasts. It's like riding the electric bike for the first time. It just feels like you have superpowers. And that is really wonderful to encourage you to keep going and find out where to go from there. I've got a project over the next couple weeks where I'm helping a client with a vision deck. That's sort of a go-to-market strategy in their job and how they are going to handle the next 24 months of their career. And it's not the work I traditionally do, is strategy and narratives and presentation materials, but I'm approaching it the same way, where my first step is an aggregation of different examples of similar presentations or understanding of the industry that they're in, feeding this to a model. And then my second step is to write 4 or 5 pages of a prompt describing in the first person, saying, I have this client that works for this company and they need to do this, this, and this, and they feel like that. And here's my goal for the next couple of weeks. I need this presentation set, and it should be like this and talk like this and not do too much of this or too much of that. And really try to establish these guardrails so that when I train this model, I can have a starting point of different sections and different outcomes, and a voice and a narrative that will come out of that. And I see that's similar to the UX experiences. Like, I want somebody to move through this application. And my hope is that with patterns, and we're all succumb to patterns of what slides look like or what interfaces look like, is that we've trained this to the point where you can start to identify patterns of outputs. With OpenAI, it outputs in Visual Basic. And all of the Microsoft tools that we've been using for decades are in Visual Basic. The PowerPoints and the Microsoft documents, that's just output of Visual Basic code. And so from a marketing and go-to-market perspective, to try to tie those into one another, I think is going to be an interesting exercise. And then layering on top of that, how do you reference a design system or a pattern library so that it's an effective extension of the brand? It's a technical challenge, but it's one that I want to make sure that we start with enough curiosity and investigation and tweaking to feel like you can make that kind of velocity like one would on an electric bike.
That moment of the electric bike is very powerful. I've tried one once and it's a bit scary.
Do they
I
have them?
want to go.
There's that park. Is it the East End Park? There's one where everybody
Oh,
goes
you're
home.
right.
I'm
Yes,
sure.
there's East Coast Park.
Yeah.
We
It's
actually used to have e-scooters, which were so much fun, but there are too many of them. They got a bit dangerous, so they're banned now. But they do
yeah.
still have electric bikes.
Good. Good. I hope you, with the weather improving, I hope that you find some time to feel that velocity.
Yes. I want to go back in time. You've mentioned before, I think it was in 2010 was the year that UX actually became almost a proper discipline. And the inflection point was around the release of the iPhone. What was it about the iPhone that led to this inflection of UX actually becoming more of a discipline?
It just works was the statement when people used Macs. I don't know if it was an advertising campaign. It might have been. It just works. There wasn't all of this blue screen of death and issues with software and hardware. Okay, so how do you define it just works? Well, okay, the experience is very tailored. They've removed all the noise of things that you don't need to know right now, and they've stepped you through and gave you affirmation of progress so that when you got to the end, it felt intuitive and easy. And so there was also this notion of design as it was in a new medium, and that was on a mobile device. We saw the advent of, after the first couple versions of iPhones and Androids, where everybody had their own design concept of what an app should look and feel like, that the manufacturers of Google and Apple said, it's going to be better from a brand value perspective if we can provide templates, design systems. Project Kennedy was a version of Google, and Apple had Cocoa, and you sort of can color in the dots or sort of connect the dots and color in the lines of what these apps should look like. So it became commoditized along with the advent of freelancing platforms where you could find a designer in places near and far to do designs for you. And so that commoditization of design really brought the question of, okay, if it looks good, and it's now, I mentioned subjectivity and objectivity, how do we improve the objectivity of somebody using an app to do something? And that's where the breaking of UI and UX were now. There was still plenty of work for UI designers who wanted to make sure that the visual aspect was good, but a sort of secondary or a side-by-side discipline was user experience, where we started to understand what it meant to do qualitative research or analysis of log files and feedback surveys. And so that experience aspect ensured that what we were going through as an experience met our expectations and didn't have friction points or any parts of confusion, regardless of how the design looked. It was what was being, with that cognition, that human cognition of moving through, in this case, a digital experience.
And leaping ahead a number of years, you then found yourself analyzing, I think it was 44 million Airbnb reviews.
Yeah.
What
That
was
was
that process like? And what was the difference between how you analyzed these 44 million versus what you were doing back in, say, 2010?
Yeah, I mean, it was data visualization, which meant you had to work with some form of data, qualitative and quantitative. And the fun thing about that, it was Airbnb, and they were trying to improve the vertical of private room stays, because in many cities around the world, I'm not sure if Singapore, but certainly San Francisco and certainly Barcelona, they were hitting issues with regulations on entire home rentals. But if you wanted somebody, Nate, to stay in your room, Airbnb couldn't do anything about that. But they were seeing that stagnation of that vertical in their market, and they wanted to understand what it meant for a positive private room stay. And so they took all the 5-star, what we did is we took all the 5-star reviews and all the 1 to 4-star reviews, and we listened to their internal research team to hear what their hypotheses were on different areas, things like location and access, privacy, the host itself. And we began to mine the reviews, first stripping out all of the pronouns and noise. We began to mine those reviews for how sentiment and hierarchy and usage and context in, again, qualitative text, how it changed between positive and not positive reviews. And we found some fascinating associations that when the host was establishing a common ground between guest and host, it improved extremely. There was a discrepancy there, a significance of how they found themselves being rated positively when location wasn't involved. It was one of the biggest aspects of it, especially in those areas of which you would find the condominium complex on the shorefront of the beach, that the host was able to communicate, here is the advantages of being in this part of town, whereas the concierge at the hotel might not have the same kind of insight. So it was a very interesting project because it was unlike anything we had done before to work with data of that size and perform analysis and visualization and stand up a portal so that they could make the investigations themselves. That's not something we've always done is try to be the usher or the gateway to analysis rather than the deliverers or the bearers of analysis. We always wanted to spin up things that were accessible so that internal teams could see and use it on their own and then have their own hypotheses from it so that we were not just trying to sort of heavy hand it of this is only what we think. So yeah, it was a really amazing project. Again, COVID came and changed the direction of the company while we were still there. And so, that page had turned.
And that was using AI, right, to help you in the analysis?
Yeah, it was using natural language processing, which was the basis for language models, where you were doing sentiment analysis and you were doing voice and tone and your hierarchy. And so NLP, natural language processing, was the precursor to LLMs. And these were the days before they called it AI. But when we're working at that scale, you can start to see those same kind of connections and vertices of association with speech, or in our case now, with language and text.
How would you approach that project differently today with the state of AI at this point? Would the NLP still be a good way to approach it, or are there better options now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would imagine there are better options. We were using libraries that were open source. I would still go in that direction. I don't think paying for an off the shelf product and trying to have that same sort of customization would make sense. The work that I've done in the past couple months, I've been working with a philanthropist and helping them with, I guess it's narratives and messaging. And my first thought was, okay, this is an area I know nothing about. They're in a part of philanthropy that I really have little experience in. And I thought, okay, I'm going to create a RAG, a retrieval automated generation, my own model for which I can seed it with all of this information, all of these PDF files, and train it to be smart about this subject. Now, the difference is because I'm training it, I have the ability to do two things. One is make sure that every reference you give me is attributable. Whereas today, if you type it into GPT, you're not going to get the same kind of attribution. It's going to give you answers that can't be confirmed. And with the case of this project and in this audience and this client, it has to have reference. So that was the first thing. And the second thing was it needs to talk in the tone of the client who has a very whimsical and playful tone. And so I need to sort of feed it with articles that they've written in the past so that it sounds like it comes from them. And that's the thing that language models are really good at. It can understand pop culture references and sort of levity. If you ever try to take a bit of text and ask a GPT to explain it like or write it like a 5-year-old, it's an interesting way of dumbing down its output into what a 5-year-old might say. So the same thing is true with the philanthropist. And so it's an example of, this is a new tool I would like to play with. These are new experiences I would like to start to author. And we're struggling because the cost of them is so high, of training and running these models is so high, which is why you're seeing all the issues around data centers and energy usage of AI being pushed to the forefront. And it is still fairly rudimentary on our side to try to train this to produce a good output. So if we were to do this again today, there would be some customization of models. There would be some understanding what the libraries were and how to figure out the hosting environment and deployment for something that large. That would be a challenge.
I love how you are very tech forward and you're using all of these things like building your own custom RAG, which is something I also love doing. I actually built one recently where I built a custom RAG, random access, I forget what it stands for, but context for AI.
Retrieval automated generation, I think.
That one, thank you.
Yep.
To build an AI that could answer emails for me based on the things that I know. And it was a lot of fun. It didn't work super well. It's very hard to get these things to be built right, but it was a lot of fun to build. I wonder, for folks listening who are not into tinkering with code in that way, do you think that's a skill they need to build? Or is it more of take the skills that you do enjoy and you can do UX marketing through those skills. You don't necessarily need to do it through engineering skills.
Yeah, I think it's the identification of process for a client. Again, as a consultant, I'm sort of introduced into new concepts and new people of which you don't have time to hem and haw and figure out what you need to know. You're sort of asked to hit the ground running and get up to speed very quickly. And so, what does that mean? That means on one side, make sure you talk to people, make sure you're invited into meetings, make sure you introduce yourself, make sure you have sort of some understanding of who it is and what the opinions are and what the lay of the land is. A humanist, qualitative side to any sort of introduction, whether it be you've just got a full time job or you're now brought in for a determinate period of time. I would never substitute that and think that uh, a computer could do my work for me. That being said, just as you had a sort of context of use of answering emails or providing market research or whatever it might be, recognize that a part of your process is, if you're at a full time job, is starting to poke around the intranet and start to see the files and do some aggregation of what's out there and what have people written, what's the existing knowledge base. And if
Yeah.
there's not one that exists, or even if there is one that exists, take that down and start to train your own assistant, your own electric bike, right? You sort of train it on the route that you want to go onto. And that's where I find myself is that for every context, I'm spinning up a knowledge base. Now, before it would all sit in a Google Drive folder and I would scan it or search against it. But now I'm using it to train and I'm sort of that aggregation process, which for those people who are entering the field as juniors, that's a great thing that they can do is to go get me relevant information on this subject. Help me train this thing so that as we go forward, it has more and more context of what kind of questions we're going to answer, what needs we might have, and the format in which we want it delivered in. And that goes back to this marketing and PowerPoint presentation is like, see if you can find some templates, see if you can find some examples of other people at other agencies that have done similar work. And oh, by the way, here are 50 different PDF files talking about this process. And so when I ask you to create a section of a presentation that deals with organizational change or training, you'll have an informed opinion about what it is you're spitting back out. What I don't want to do is just close my eyes and hope that it spits out the right thing. I want to help the algorithm be guided to where it goes. And then you sort of bring it back to the human conversation to like, well, what do you think? This is a draft? Is this something that hits? Where am I missing it? And then it becomes that loop again of humanist versus technology.
Yes. Okay, before we go in a different direction, there's one thing that I wanted to share that I think is quite fun there. You mentioned explain this like I'm 5. Another prompt that I found really fun, especially when dealing with something that maybe is a bit more dry or it's the end of a long day and I am a bit tired of reading, is to explain this to me in the style of the Morning Brew, the popular newsletter. And it tends to make whatever the content is a lot more fun. I also often put in like keep it accurate because sometimes it can be too fun and lose the accuracy. But that can be a great prompt as well once you have that knowledge base in the background.
Yeah.
I want to go. Yes.
I just came off of a week with a guy who had a different relationship with the algorithm than I did. On some of these conversations, I've been asked about AI girlfriends and companions, and I've sort of shrugged it off of like, oh, you're just being silly, or that's not a context of use I would ever see myself in. And it isn't. But this gentleman had a relationship with technology and his device that I didn't. And he would talk to it. He would ask it questions and really carry on a dialogue because it's easier than thumbing on a phone. But the nature of conversation, and you mentioned Morning Brew and the radio voice in your ear, it was really interesting to watch him do the back and forth of answer, respond, answer, respond, answer, respond, to the point where I thought, A, he's lonely and he doesn't have a whole lot of friends, and B, it's providing as much emotional support to him as it is factual accuracy. So didn't mean to spin you off of your next question, but that was something that came to mind of how you can use some of this dialogue to be entertaining as well as informative.
True, true. And that is a whole fascinating area, very rapidly developing. I'm curious to go into teams. You, during COVID, did a study that was around the world, but of course, it's during COVID. So you had team members that were actually around the world that you were working with. I think you were in Brazil, France, Japan, or rather, you were not, but your team was. How did you maintain the quality of the research while working remotely with other people who are then representing this research in other places?
Yep. You go with, you can ask out, you go with human connections, people that you trust to have the right answer. And in those cases, it was very much a leap of faith where, depending upon where you were and the people you're introduced to, ethnographers, photographers, references of which resources or people we needed to talk to. And the project you're mentioning was a study on skateboarding culture. There's a game coming out called Skate 3, I think Skate 4. It's a skating video game, and we were looking at 7 different skate cultures from around the world. And so this was very insular subcultures. Again, you've mentioned the countries of where we went into, but to be able to find the networks of people that can give you those resources and those references to people within those subcultures or did that kind of work, I guess that was the first stop. It's not necessarily how do I find a photographer in Brazil, which would be what you would type into a search engine or a algorithm. It's how do I find networks of people that can tell me where a photographer, or how do I find a network of photographers where somebody in Brazil can be recommended? And so that's where I found myself, is finding those pools and those community where there are hundreds of experts and one of them had a good reference in there. Um, going from nothing into something, you don't want to go for the first thing you can find or the top result in this page. You want to find yourself in a community where others can provide you reference and resource. And so that was a way of static to noise, of reducing that ratio a little bit. um, and it wasn't perfect. It was something that had to be managed and mitigated. So that after the first city that we did this in, we adjusted the parameters and the number of interviews and how we started to collect and present the data. So we were always learning and adapting for that. But that study went on for over a year and was a lot of fun too. I just wish I could go to those cities rather than staying back in a quarantined household.
That would be lovely. And I think you hit on a really key piece there, which is even in the age of the internet, the age of these algorithms, knowing the right people can get you to the right people in a way that the internet simply cannot, unless you're like finding a house on Airbnb where there are all of these reviews. How do you locate the network? If you don't already know someone who is connected to a photographer in Brazil, skate culture, how do you find a network that would connect you there?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's, you go to the industry leaders, the thought leaders such as yourself, and you figure out who these loud voices are and where they find community. There's an interesting one about, you mentioned engineers and how that kind of reminds you of one of them. I've had a lot of DevOps and cybersecurity companies in the past that I've either worked for full time or consulted for. And a part of it is, especially if you have an infrastructure brand company, you've got to find your end users who are notoriously private and insular and male, and you can't get them through email because they know all the filters and are impervious to advertisement. However, there are a couple times a year that they come out of their cave and go to conferences and want to talk about what's the latest in their industry. And oftentimes they'll signal that on Twitter or Discord or LinkedIn, those are all 3 good places to find people talking about things, that they're going and that they'd love to meet up and see who's around. And so when you have a conference on the calendar and there are those that are signaling that they're going to the conference, is to reach out and say, hey, I'll be at this booth. I would love to meet you and walk you through. Or I'll go to this networking event, and really just start to try to meet up. There was one that we did for a config, which was a design conference here, where we knew all these people were going to them, and we created a robo-taxi tour so that if you were coming from Singapore and you'd never ridden in a robo-taxi, we would meet you out in front of the convention center and sit with you on a loop. And I developed this map where you could see all the history of different design milestones in San Francisco over the last 25 years. The first Airbnb or IDEO was here, or, there was this sort of map of it. So you were offering something back to the community. You're also showing that, hey, on Friday night, there's a party here. On Saturday night, there's a party there. On Sunday, there's a party there. And you were sort of being able to be a contributor to the community as well as hoping to take away conversations and interviews and perspectives from the participants themselves. So always thinking about what you can contribute as well as what you can take away.
Ooh, and that is also such a powerful and important piece in any sort of business work is what can you contribute? We so often think of just ourselves. Speaking of contributing, sometimes those contributions are not actually wanted. And so I wanted to go into this area of when you find something, maybe in this ethnography study of skateboarding culture, maybe elsewhere, and you need to bring that unpleasant finding to your stakeholders or the C-suite. How do you present it in a way that they can actually accept rather than they say, no, I reject that perspective?
Yeah. The danger is when you present and they say, well, we knew all of that. We already knew all of that. So what? And that's an uncomfortable feeling is because you've been paid tens of thousands of dollars to get to this point of presentation. And your stakeholder says, so what? And it's like, well, okay, what you could do as a researcher, as a designer, is to start to understand the solution so that when we do this a second time, it's not brought up again. We can address it by these things. And even if the observation doesn't land, we can make sure that it's addressed in this manner. And I guess that's true with not only negative feedback, but feedback that's already been heard, is to anticipate that it's not going to land with this aha, but maybe a ho hum or a oh well. And here's how we can alleviate this pain. Here we remove this friction. So it's the second part of any research project, at least from my standpoint as the designer. I always want to design a solution to a problem as a researcher that I want to illustrate as well.
And that is interesting because that's advice I've come across, even just as a person in a company, like maybe a mid-level marketer. It can be stage one is like, oh, I found this problem. Let me bring this to my leader. Stage two, which is essential, is let me bring the solution to the problem as well. Because if you're just bringing problems, we already have plenty of problems. But if you can bring a solution to a problem, that's really wonderful. It's interesting to see that even in like a formal UX study, that still remains a really important piece. I want to go deeper into conferences because you have a bit of an unusual perspective here. Normal UX is more of like you bring people in, you do a 1 hour study, et cetera, et cetera. Your strategy seems to be more of you go out to where they are, you do shorter studies with more people. What do you think is the advantage of that?
It's field research. It's not academic research. A lot of researchers are trained academically, and it's fantastic. It's the structure and the rigor and the analysis that provides. But, in an academic setting, you want to make sure every testing environment is uniform, that you have comparable results. But oftentimes, especially with startups and young founders, you need to go where the users are. I always have such delight when I'm using SaaS company, early stage SaaS company, and the CEO says, want some time on my calendar? I always click that because it is an affirmation that this outreach is a good thing for them, and to build that into the ethos of a company early on where the CEO can hear that feedback will help them guide the roadmap of features and requirements and where they're going to steer their product. And it's fun for them, or maybe it's stressful for them to see how people are using it versus what they intended. There was a product in which the CEO had no clue that people were using his product in this manner. It was partially because it was broken. There were things that were supposed to be fast and intuitive and consistent that weren't. And workarounds were needed to be made to accommodate the shortcomings of their product. And meanwhile, they're trying to sell off this other part or audience that I had no interest in. And what I wanted is for them to fix the thing that was broken so I didn't have to do this workaround anymore. For those founders that are listening, to build in a feedback loop into your organization, your culture, and your product so that you can constrain them. You can have several interviews and conversations with random people like Nate and I are having a conversation about what it is they're doing, and they'll share their screen with you and show you what their context of use is. But that's a huge advantage to you to get that early feedback cycle so that you can make your prioritizations and adjustments accordingly.
And I feel like one of the things that's most fascinating to me when I've done something like this is the things that the person would answer in, say, a survey would be much more about what they are consciously aware of. But when you actually sit down with them and you spend an hour, and it can feel, I come from more of an analytical background, so it can feel, to me at least, almost like a waste of time. Like I'm sitting down with one user. This is just a single data point. It's qualitative. It's not quantitative. Who knows if this scales? But when you sit down with that one person, you get to see a bit into their subconscious or the things they're not really aware of. And then you realize, like, you're doing this whole workaround. No one ever told me they were doing this workaround. Maybe other people also are doing this workaround and I should fix it.
Yeah, those kinds of discoveries I would hope are very helpful. And I agree with you on the quant side. It's from there you start to see these patterns, yes, through single points over and over again. And then you look into the log files and you think, that's affirmed. The quant is affirmed by the qual. And you start to see those trends at a greater scale. But you need that insight and you need that inspiration of what to look for.
That is interesting. I've often thought about it as the quantitative will tell me what is happening and the qualitative will tell me why it's happening. But this makes me think there's also sometimes the qualitative needs to come first before I get into the what. I also need to know from a qualitative perspective what's happening and then validate that with the quant.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Mixed methods, it's an ongoing cycle. Hear the why to know what to look for. And then that's when you can go into that, in this case, log file or part of that application and try to see why this isn't taking place. So it feeds itself.
Yes. And for anyone listening who's like, what on earth is a log file? A log file is basically like a diary written by code. It tells what the code has done over the course of time so you can see what a user has done if your engineers wrote good logs, which hopefully they did.
Yeah. Oh, and pro tip for those of you who vibe code, always display logs or a debug panel. Have something as you're trying to build out an application that is an info level log statement, because then you can start to see how the application is talking to itself and where the different components are happening. It's a really great hack just to be able to debug in real time, even if you're building interfaces and no integrations, is to understand what loads correctly and what doesn't, is to build in logging to any design application.
100%. When I'm doing a bit of vibe coding myself, I will almost always tell the program to write logs. And then if something goes wrong, most of my debugging is just copying the log, pasting it into the AI and saying, figure out what's wrong. And it works very well. Speaking of AI, I actually wanted to go in that direction. You've talked about using AI personas and AI to ideate ideas and maybe having those two AIs actually talk to each other. Before we get into that, what do you think is the role of AI in personas? Does it actually represent the user well? And how do you make it consistently do that?
AI in personas. I don't love it. I think a persona is meant to convey human emotions. It's meant to provide context and a micro view of whatever larger picture you're trying to display. Sure, you can create mid-journey images of this persona going through different steps of a process. That helps, storyboards and things like that, and maybe flesh out the sides of it. But when you're dealing with something that is, again, meant to convey relatability, so that as the viewer looks at this persona and can relate to them and their challenges and their needs, when you make that artificial at all, that becomes a little harder of a parse. The same thing is with like simulated users, where you're trying to stress test or find holes in your application by simulating survey responses or users. Like, no, I think there are things that the artifact is one thing to help put into place, but the strategy and the reasoning is a little harder to accept generative tools as being able to deliver a good product. Now, I could be wrong. Somebody could. I use AI for market research and positioning to find different products and where it might fit in the market, as well as narratives that positioning might generate. And that's pretty close. I ask for ICPs, ideal customer profiles of if this product is going to attract these kinds of ICPs, how can I start to address that? And now we're getting into strategy and go to market, and personas are a part of that. But I would caution that when you're using things to really try to convey relatability and context, that any sort of sniff test of you just generated this is going to met with an upturned nose. We are in the first week of September here in California and Singapore, which is also back to school season. And I am a parent of a high schooler who will be using AI for their homework and their schoolwork. And there's no school policies on this as of yet. And so it's a lot of it is just sort of self-policing and knowing what to do appropriately and what's not. And, when asked to do things like self-reflection of, the first time you did this, or what do you feel about that, to bring in generative text, it doesn't feel appropriate. However, if I need to sort of come up with a statistical analysis or something that's a little bit more, again, this artifact rather than this emotion, then the landscape might change a little bit. And so I see that analogy with how we use these tools for, again, things that are meant to be received differently.
That is fascinating. And I think similarly, I've noticed it can become a crutch that takes away some of my own skill. If I rely too much on I may forget some of the skills or just not use that muscle. On the other hand, if I really do understand an area quite well, I can run a lot faster by using AI to like write some code or do something that I do understand. And it can be very effective. What do you think are the best use cases of AI right now in the area of UX?
Yeah, I'm fortunate to be in a discipline and in a profession that uses this. I don't have to apologize. I think a lot of AI in the workplace is met with suspicion and feels like you're cheating. I mean, same thing with the high school that I described. And so, I plead for amnesty of the ability to use these in whatever context available. And I've got friends who use it for cocktail recipes or to, in the case, write emails, which is fine. But, you know, to bring it into different parts of, there's different methods of thinking. There's generative thinking and there's synthesis. And generative is that we want to see what's out there and see what's available. And synthesis is that we're trying to distill it down. And I think that there's no such thing as writer's block anymore. You should never be at a point where you can't have generative thought because we've got these tools now that can show you a dozen different directions. Maybe two or three of them are good, but can take you down these paths that will lead you to a point where you're starting to synthesize. Now, the danger is that we don't think outside of that initial instruction, nor do we take with a critical eye some of the synthesis of auditing and understanding and curating and reforming and shaping what might have been generated. So I'm using it quite a bit because it, again, going back to this electric bike, I know how to fix the gears. I know how to, if the chain detaches or the tire pops, I can fix a bicycle. So if this thing were to break or the context is wrong or the message is off or it doesn't quite get the prompt, I know how to get it tweaked and ready to the point where I could still make progress with it. I think the danger is when you're sort of over your skis, sorry to mix the metaphors here, when you're over your handlebars and you don't quite know what it is you're doing. This goes back to the design and development context of using vibe coding with an understanding of the environment for which you're building it in, using generative tools to create PowerPoints or documents and presentations with the understanding that you're going to go in and edit it and that it has a certain legibility to it, and a message that resonates versus just trying to substitute human work with output that will get us nowhere.
Before we come to the end of the interview, I want to spend some time on marketing. So a lot of the folks listening are marketers. What can we do as marketers to work better and more efficiently with our UX friends?
Sure. I mean, with UX, how can we do? We're all pulling from the same brand system. We're all pulling from the same identity. We're all meant to convey the same ideals of whatever organization that we're working for. And so the more that we can communicate consistently about what the distinctions are for this brand and how do we manifest that in customer experience and user experience and digital experience, that is an aligned message. And so I think that that kind of knowledge share will align marketing and UX quite nicely is that they're able to say if this was a company that stood for XYZ, how would we design it? And if this was a company that was ABC, how would we design this? And so to be able to kind of find that commonality and that shared understanding of this is a type of experience that conveys just as it would a marketing message or a photo campaign or whatever it might be, whatever extension it might be. I think that those two are side by side.
And do you feel, from my perspective, it seems like there's a lot of overlap between the two. We're talking about research, we're talking about qualitative, quantitative. These are things I do from within marketing, you do from within UX. To what degree are these separate fields and what are the areas where you think it really starts to become separate?
The the spinning off into user experience research was unexpected. The engagement that I mentioned with the skateboarders, that was market research and customer research. But it was all the same principles and practices. Like there were no differences between how we were gathering, collecting, and presenting data, and we were using personas and archetypes and trends and analysis, just as it would as a market or a customer researcher. So there's really very little difference. Maybe it can be the cycles can be shorter for UX because again the product design cycles might be shorter than what it takes to take an entire product or brand to market. It can often be a larger moving target than say, oh well, we can build a website in a weekend. We just want some usability feedback, something that's much more low level. But the methods should be the same, the approaches, and as you described, the what and the whys between quant and qual, those are analogous no matter who your audience is.
And in your engagements you've done with companies or when you've worked directly at a company, what are the teams within a company that you find yourself working with most? Is it marketing or are there other teams that are even closer partners?
Yeah. When in the UX space, traditionally, it's been product and increasingly so engineering. And engineering just because they've been engineering focused companies. Design used to say, I want a seat at the table, I want my own sort of leadership role. And now it's an extension of product. That kind of argument's gone away as, again, things have consolidated. We realize that product is sort of driving it, and under that, design and engineering are coexisting. And so that tends to be on the UX side, the clientele that we work with most. On the marketing and research side, the product isn't as prevalent, and it's now customer insights and marketing leads. So depending upon the application of the process, our stakeholders change.
That is awesome. Well, before we close the interview, I want to give some space for people to learn more about you. Where can they go to learn more about you, the work you do, and how they could engage with you if they wanted to get your expertise?
Yeah, for any designers out there, coming off of that project that is described where we sort of eschewed the design process and went right to the code base and began to build from there. It illustrated to me what I saw was a vulnerability in our design community, that there were mid-level and senior designers that all of a sudden would be fighting to stay relevant if they didn't choose to adopt a similar disruptive methodology. And so as a result, I created a readiness assessment, and the URL is retrain.gauge.io. That's GAUGE. And it's an assessment survey to say, okay, here's how I stack up against people in my industry or of the same organization size or the same team size in 5 different areas of adoption, and trying to identify, are any barriers or roadblocks? Are they cultural? Are they from a technology perspective? Where do you find in the workflows you're currently using generative tools? And then hopefully with that assessment can give you some insight and feedback towards how you might go and advocate for an upskilling or retraining, as the URL suggests, of your teams so that we can stay relevant and we can stay employed.
That is fantastic. If you're on YouTube, that'll be linked below. If you're on a podcast, that'll be linked in the show notes. Nick, thanks for coming on the show. This has been a lot of fun.
Nate, Desmond, I hope you get back on the bike, and thanks for having me on.